share my screen. Everyone can see?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
Great. Okay. So let me just make it full screen real quick.
And I'll just say that anybody who's not presenting, I think you feel welcome to use the chat. We'll have questions after the presentation.
Yep.
And raise your hand at that point. Okay, go ahead, Matt.
Okay. Okay. So I might not be able to check the chat, so you can just shout out to me if I'm running low on time. I'm going to present some preliminary work that I have joint with Gordon Dahl at UCSD. I'm Matt Knepper at University of Georgia. So basically, in this paper, we're going to we have a hypothesis about why we think that sexual harassment is, or in particular, workplace sexual harassment is vastly underreported. And we're going to come up with an empirical test for this hypothesis, and I'm going to show you some evidence. Briefly to start out, I think the way I want to motivate the talk is just to describe with data probably a pretty well-known fact, which is that workplace sexual harassment is massively underreported. So one way that we confirmed this with data is we looked at a series, so 3 different anonymous surveys on workplace sexual harassment. So these come from the General Social Survey, the National Study on Sexual Harassment and Assault, and the 2015 American Working Conditions Survey. And taking the most conservative estimates from these surveys, we found that roughly 1 in 28 US workers reports having been victimized by workplace sexual harassment over the prior year. So the key thing is that these are anonymous surveys. There's no sense in which individuals reveal themselves or reveal who they are. There's no way in which you could think that the response to the survey would ever get back to the employer. And so that's important to keep in mind in light of the fact that we have data on the actual number of formal sexual harassment charges filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from 2000 to 2015. And when we use these data, we find that roughly 1 in 11,000 workers files a formal sexual harassment charge. And so, taking these at face value, it looks like roughly 99.8% of all workers don't report sexual harassment, even though they've been a victim of workplace sexual harassment. So you could think that, right, like a good chunk of this, we argue, reflects underreporting. Of course, some of the disparity could probably be explained by the fact that filling out an anonymous survey is relatively costless relative to filing a charge, right? But what we're going to focus on is the consequences of filing a charge, because that's where we think the action's happening. So anyway, this suggests, based on this just very brief analysis and analysis that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has done, the argument is that the underreporting rate is somewhere between 75 and 99.8%, right? And so this is important to keep in mind, looking at the aggregate data, and I'll point out why. So basically, if you just focus on the gray bars, right, you'll see that over time, the volume of sexual harassment charges that are filed with the EEOC, at least from the year 2000 to the year 2016, which are the years for which we have data, the rate of filing has been cut in half, right? And so a naive interpretation of this might be that, well, this is a good thing, right? Maybe the problem of workplace sexual harassment has been diminishing over time. But if you start looking at the fraction of these charges that involve retaliation, you see the exact opposite trend, right? And so a more cynical interpretation of this data is not that the problem of workplace sexual harassment has gotten better, but rather that firms have become more adept at credibly wielding the threat of retaliation in order to suppress worker reports. Okay, and so that's kind of the hypothesis that we have. In particular, we think that firms and managers coerce victims of workplace sexual harassment into silence through the threat of retaliation. So how do we test this idea? Basically, the argument is that whether or not a worker is willing to report is going to be a function of the value of their outside options. So when their outside options diminish in the labor market, that should mean that the potential costs of enduring a retaliatory firing are going to be higher, right? Because the value of unemployment is lower. And so the way that we test this idea is we use data from the EEOC. For each charge, they run a follow-up investigation, after which they make a determination as to whether or not a charge has merit. And we use that as a proxy for the quality or selectivity of charges. So the argument is that when a worker's outside options diminish, the selectivity of the charges that they file should increase. And this would, under pretty mild assumptions, this is synonymous with underreporting increasing. And so before I answer the question, let me so just briefly tell you about the two sources of variation. So we're going to use sort of local labor market variation in the form of negative labor demand shocks from the years 2000 to 2015. So that's going to capture the mild early 2000s recession plus the Great Recession. And then we're going to use identifying variation from a quasi-natural experiment, which comes in the form of a dramatic rollback of North Carolina's unemployment insurance program, which happened in 2013, right? And so because we argue that the workers' willingness to report is a function of the value of the outside options, it follows that a reduction in the generosity of the social safety net program could further suppress reporting behavior by, basically ex ante making workers more likely to endure higher costs in the event that they file a charge and then get fired. So let me just check the chat. Oh, 5 to 7 minutes, sorry. Okay. Next, I just wanted to present some simple summary statistics, just an overview of the data. So what we've done here is we've tried to demonstrate that sexual harassment charges, and these are EEOC charges, are very different from non-sexual harassment charges. So the first thing I've pointed out is that the merit rate is about 50% higher for sexual harassment charges than non-sexual harassment charges. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out here is that the selectivity, while the selectivity is higher, it's also true that the fraction of these charges that involve employer retaliation is more than double the fraction of charges that involve retaliation when sexual harassment is not involved, right? So these are kind of suggestive facts that are consistent with the story that the main reason that workers don't report sexual harassment is fear of retaliation, and it's justified by the data, and this is likely the reason or our hypothesis for why the quality of these charges is higher. And then one other important fact to point out, which again is probably not much of a surprise to anyone here, the vast majority of sexual harassment victims tend to be women. About 84% of all individuals who file a charge of sexual harassment are women, as opposed to roughly 50-50 for non-sexual harassment charges like race or age discrimination, for example. Okay, so since this is a short talk, I'll skip right to results. So here what we've done in the left panel, I've graphed the residualized rate of merit, taking out industry and state fixed effects as a function of the local state industry unemployment rate, right? And you can see that there's a pretty strong positive relationship between the two, which is confirmatory evidence for a hypothesis. Now, if you don't like the merit variable, right, because you think it might be potentially subject to biases, or you think that there's the way that the EEOC evaluates charges is changing over the business cycle, what we've done as sort of a robustness check is we submitted a FOIA request and got data on all of the charges that eventually became EEOC lawsuits. So it's a very self-selected sample. It's about 0.3% of all filed charges actually become lawsuits because the EEOC has limited resource constraints and it must choose cases based on their potential for sort of changing precedents. And so we went through these cases and we determined whether or not sexual coercion was alleged, right? And so the reason we did this is because we think that it's a nice measure of sort of the severity of a case that is kind of consistent with the idea that we're testing. So just briefly, sexual coercion implies that there was sort of either an implicit or explicit exchange of sexual favors, either for a reward or more likely to avoid a punishment, right? And so we view this is an extremely sort of rare form of sexual harassment, as has been found in other data sources. And so we view this as sort of an unmistakable sign of the severity of the case. And we find, again, that just looking at the relationship between the state unemployment rate and the fraction of cases where sexual coercion is alleged, the hypothesis is upheld. Okay. All right. And so I'll try to finish the next part pretty quickly. So basically, the North Carolina implemented a massive unemployment insurance reform in July of 2013 in response to insolvency concerns over its state UI funds. So all told, basically the maximum value of their unemployment insurance basically fell by 50%, right? Because they reduced the number of benefit weeks from 26 to 12 to 20 based on state unemployment rates. And then they also cut maximum weekly benefits by about 35%, right? So it's a massive decrease in sort of the generosity of the social safety net, right? And so you can see that borne out here in what you could think of as a first stage. This just graphs the short-term UI recipiency rate, which is the fraction of all individuals who are unemployed for 26 weeks or fewer who are actually receiving UI benefits. So when you compare it with all the other non-treated states, right around the time of the reform in July of 2013, the recipiency rate's about 35%. About 3 years later, while the recipiency rate stays roughly the same in all other states, it drops to about 10% in North Carolina. So it's about a 70% reduction. So you can think of this as sort of the ex ante probability that you would receive UI in the event that you file a sexual harassment charge and are fired as a consequence of that. Okay, so to show results, what we've done is basically constructed synthetic controls. So what I'm showing here is we're going back to the EEOC charge data, and I'm showing the rate of merit on sexual harassment charges that are filed, right? And so you can see that as you would expect with a properly functioning synthetic control program, both the synthetic control states and North Carolina mirror one another prior to the reform. And you can also see that there's actually a general downward trend here, which is also consistent with the first part of the paper, right? So we found that merit was countercyclical, and we know that the reform happened in late 2013 as the economy was in general recovering. And so, you know, normally you want to see flat trends, but here it actually makes sense that we get a negative trend for both North Carolina and the synthetic controls. Nonetheless, you see a dramatic jump up in the selectivity of sexual harassment charges that are filed following the reform just in North Carolina. This amounts to roughly about a 9 percentage point increase off of a baseline of 27% merit. So that's about a 30% increase in the selectivity or quality of charges. So I'll just briefly conclude. So essentially, we find that indeed workers underreport sexual harassment when the value of their outside option is low, either in the form of slack labor market conditions or low value of unemployment insurance. Each 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate increases sexual harassment selectivity by 1 percentage point. And so briefly, I'll conclude on policy. So there are a number of ways that we thought, there are a number of things that might be of concern to policymakers, ways that they can sort of address this issue of sexual harassment underreporting. So first, you could very simply raise the penalties for charges involving retaliation. Another thing is that penalties could be made countercyclical to more aggressively deter this kind of behavior, particularly when the costs of speaking out are the highest. And then the last point that we want to make is sort of more general related to the economics literature. Particularly with UI, a lot of papers have studied sort of the ex post moral hazard effects of UI. That is, you know, whether or not generous UI causes people to stay out of the labor force. But we actually find some ex ante moral hazard effects, which is to say, we find effects of UI on individuals who are not yet unemployed and may not ever be unemployed, right? In the form of their being more willing to speak out against worker abuses such as sexual harassment in the event that they're victimized by it. So it looks like I'm about out of time, so I'll yield to questions.
That's great, Matt. Thank you. This is really important and interesting work. So yeah, we have a couple minutes for questions if there are any. I don't see any in the chat right now, but
I'll jump in with a question, even though Matt, I probably asked you this before. But I was just wondering here, I mean, another story for what's going on is that kind of when outside options deteriorate, sort of like the incidence of sexual harassment increases because employers or managers who have some predatory interests might see that as a opportune time. I mean, perhaps for the reasons that you're pointed out, and I just wonder how you think about, or whether you think about disentangling those two different mechanisms.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, so we've thought a lot about this. So yeah, as you've pointed out, at this point, we've just looked at the quality of charges. We've said nothing about the volume. And largely, we think this is because the volume is kind of a second order, almost like a general equilibrium effect, right? We think that the first order thing that happens is a worker sort of raises the threshold level of sexual harassment that they're willing to tolerate before speaking out. And whether or not charges go up or down is going to depend largely on the firm's profit function, or cost function, I think is probably a better way to say it. So if they, if in particular, we argue that if their sort of costs are kind of convex in sexual harassment, then they might raise the level of sexual harassment, right? Or, which is to say, like they might, get more utility from sexual harassment, the more egregious is the nature of the offense, right? And then you could see them sort of increasing the volume in the event of lower outside options, but it could also work in the opposite direction. So we find kind of weak positive effects, but I think we're, I think in a longer presentation, we would have spoken more about this, but basically we're just focusing on kind of the first order worker response in the form of selectivity.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Matt. I'm gonna jump in and get started on mine. So my co-authors, Jason Sockin and Evan Starr, couldn't make it today, so I'm standing in with them. I'm gonna present externalities from silence, how non-disclosure agreements distort firm reputation. It's also very much a paper about sort of information flowing out about negative events. Jason and I have an earlier paper called The Inside Scoop, which echoes a lot of the themes that Matt found and looks at workers' willingness to report negative information about their employer to other workers on Glassdoor. Instead of reporting it to the EEOC, it's like reporting it online in an employer review. And we find evidence consistent with what Matt has in the sense that workers who are in firms where they face bigger retaliation risk are more likely to obscure aspects of their identity when they're making these kinds of reports, negative information. There's also a bunch of complementary evidence there too. This is kind of a follow-on paper to that, and looking at how when states change the enforceability of non-disclosure contracts that they have with employees, what happens to the flow of information from workers about firms to Glassdoor to other workers. So in the wake of the Me Too movement, especially, states have tried to reform their laws around non-disclosure agreements to try to ensure worker voice can be heard. And you can think about and so basically what we're going to do is look at how does the flow of information and reviews to Glassdoor from workers about their working conditions change in those states compared to how does it change in states that didn't change their laws to narrow the enforceability of NDAs. And in particular, we're going to combine it with data that Evan brought from surveys on pay scale, which characterize how prevalent NDAs are by industry. And so it's like a triple difference where we're comparing changes before and after the law in states that changed the law or didn't, in industries where NDAs are prevalent versus industries where NDAs aren't prevalent. More than 60% of workers report being bound by some kind of non-disclosure agreement. Generally, they're meant to protect like trade secrets, but they're often enforced and interpreted more broadly, almost as non-disparagement. And they make workers nervous about saying anything because they know that even if the suit is not have a lot of merit, they can still be, their life can get pretty messed up through a legal case that the employer could bring, threatening them for disclosing something that they shouldn't disclose. And this builds on a literature about firm reputation, that firms, reputation does help them succeed in business, help them attract workers, and that they manage their reputation. They do things to try to improve their reputation. And also that workers care about sort of non-wage aspects of jobs, and a good reputation can help them attract workers more cheaply. So this is the first empirical work. Our empirical understanding of NDAs is very limited by a lack of change in the legal regimes and difficulty measuring these things because they're all private contracts, a lot of problems. So, and what we find, the big takeaways are that what we see is that there is a decline in the average rating of firms in the state after the law changes, in the states where the laws change in high NDA industries. So in the places you'd expect it, meaning that more workers are more willing to supply more negative information about their firm. And we see it broadly, but it's especially for current workers as opposed to former workers. And current workers face bigger retaliation risks than former workers. We also see that there's a decrease in workers' probability of concealing their job title, concealing an aspect of their identity, which is something that you would do if you were worried about legal risk. So the fact that you're getting more negative information but less concealment is very consistent with this idea that that this is the mechanism that's happening. And we also see that firm average ratings become more dispersed. So this is good because it, maybe breaks a pooling equilibrium where sort of high road and low road employers look the same to the worker, where low road employers pool with high road employers, and outsiders can't tell them apart. So by increasing the dispersion of reputation, that means that outside workers are more informed about working conditions. We don't have a lot of time, so I won't get into a lot of detail, but basically what the laws do in these 3 states is make it unlawful for NDAs, so make it unenforceable for NDAs to restrict workers from talking about unlawful acts. Glassdoor, you might not be familiar with. It's basically think of it like Yelp. Instead of a consumer rating a restaurant, it's a worker rating an employer. 5 stars, can list your job title. And yeah, so these are event study kind of things with just the treatment states on the left, only exploiting the law change and the variation in NDA intensity across industries. On the right, it's sort of all the states. So then it becomes a triple difference. And you can see that, the average rating goes down. So more negative information about employers flows in after NDAs get narrowed, and it's harder to enforce them around, unlawful treatment of workers. I think I went through this stuff already. Basically, we see less identity concealment after the, or there's evidence of to some extent less identity concealment after the change. And what we're basically saying is that NDAs are a channel that suppresses negative information, distorts reputation, prevents workers from understanding the characteristics of prospective employers, militates against workers making fully informed choices and labor markets functioning efficiently, and that there is an externality here, because even the parties to an NDA, they're not the ones that bear the full cost. So like if you as a worker are harassed, you know, you and the employer might come to an agreement, but it doesn't internalize the cost to prospective employees who would like to know that information, and competing employers who are doing things right and, you know, who can't distinguish themselves because this information is not coming out. So that's the silencing externality. And yeah, these are the dispersion results. So here the outcome is the standard deviation of average firm rating in a state and industry by year. So it's like the dispersion in ratings, and you can see it tends to go up, although it's a little messy. And we do a lot of robustness, but yeah, so the findings suggest policies. So the first thing is, I think it's like evidence, again, consistent with underreporting, like Matt was saying, being an issue, that there's barriers to the flow of especially negative information. You know, if you give a restaurant a bad review on Yelp, they're not going to come after you. If you give a printer salesperson, you know, company a bad review on Amazon, your career and your livelihood are not at stake. But the labor market is different because jobs represent the most important economic relationship in most people's lives, and the stakes are just so much higher. So we think these are really first order concerns. And so finding ways to help this information flow better, and narrowing NDAs so that they really serve their intended function to protect trade secrets, but not limit workers' abilities to talk about rights, or even like their beliefs about their ability to talk about those things. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Hey, Aaron, yeah, super interesting. I had a couple of questions, and I think I actually saw it pop up on a bullet point. So let me just start with that one. So I was wondering if you looked at like changes in salaries, right? Thinking about compensating wage differentials. So, you know, after the NDA law becomes sort of less broad, right? Then maybe, you know, workers are less at risk to get harassed or be the victim of bad behavior. So you might expect that their salaries decrease. So let me just ask that one, and then if we have time, I'll ask.
Yeah, I don't think we haven't actually dug into that. It's a good question. You know, these effects are small. Like this is a very small legal change. I'm kind of shocked that we found anything.
Okay.
I think of it as more of like a proof of concept about something happening than like a huge deal in itself. So I'm not sure we'll be able to find, you know, kind of knock-on effects, but it's worth looking for. Yeah. I mean, happy to take other questions, but also we can circle back at the end. So why don't we keep moving? And the next person is Jing Kai from University of Maryland, I believe. Are you here? Awesome.
Hi, everyone. Let me go to the first page of my presentation. Okay, thanks for including our paper in this session. So I'm going to talk about improving management through worker evaluations, evidence from auto manufacturing. And this is a joint work with Shing-Yi Wang. So there's a well-known principal agent problem between firms and managers, asking how to get managers to act in the way that firms want. Theoretical work suggests that providing financial incentives to managers could be the key to solve this moral hazard problem, while empirical work suggests that some other solutions could be also effective, such as by providing trainings to employees, eliciting feedbacks, or offering consulting services. So in this paper, we investigate whether letting workers to participate in their manager's evaluation could help solving the problem. So there are several reasons of why such an evaluation strategy could be better than a top-down evaluation scheme. For example, workers might have more information about managerial inputs, which is hard to be directly observed by the firm. And this is also a direct way to reward soft skills of managers. So partnering with a big Chinese automobile factory, we introduced worker evaluations in randomly selected production teams in the firm. And we seek to answer two questions based on this design. First, what is the impact of introducing worker evaluations on workers, manager, and firm outcomes? And second, what are the mechanisms? So we consider three specific channels, including changes in managerial behavior, empowering workers by giving them voices, and also changes in team composition. So firstly, let me introduce our experimental design. So our study sample includes 76 production teams with more than 1,200 workers from a large automobile manufacturing firm in China. Our randomization is on the team level, in which 50% of the production teams were randomized into the treatment. So in those treated teams, workers are asked to evaluate the performance of their team manager each month for 8 months. So the evaluation covers 5 components, including production organization, adaptability, meaning whether the manager exhibits good judgment in emergencies and conflicts between workers, fairness, openness to suggestions, and empathy. So workers are asked to evaluate their team managers on each of those 5 dimensions on a scale from 1 to 5. So those evaluations are completely anonymous. Those are collected by people from our research team. And after they get the data, they only present aggregate statistics to the firm. And after that, the team would post the total scores of the worker evaluation monthly on the team's bulletin board. So why would managers care about the evaluation results? This could be important for them because in those treated teams, the worker evaluation score is going to enter their monthly performance assessment. So specifically, it's going to account for 20% of the monthly evaluation score, which can be important to the managers because it could influence their monthly bonus, future pay raises, and the likelihood of promotion. In control teams, there's no such worker evaluation, and managers' monthly evaluation is completely determined by their hard performance metrics. And another thing to note here is that while the evaluation itself lasts for 8 months, in the last 2 months, we did the evaluation, but we stopped to have them enter the monthly evaluation score. So we have 2 months without financial incentives. So in terms of data, we use 2 sources of data. So firstly, we have administrative data from the firm, which includes monthly data on individual level performance measures, and also team level key performance indicators, which is a team KPI. And we also got data on worker separations at the end line. In addition to that, we collected 2 rounds of surveys in which we asked questions on demographic characteristics, happiness, positive and negative mood, work satisfaction, their interaction with managers, social networks, and earning. So here is our main specification in which we use the endline data and we regress different outcomes on the dummy variable indicating whether workers in a team were given the opportunity to evaluate their managers. And we controlled for the randomization strata, the likely value of the dependent variable when it exists, and also in numerator fixed effects. So this first table presents the impact on the worker and the manager's turnover. So if you look at column 1, we can see that workers in treated teams are about 6.2 percentage points less likely to leave the company by the end line. This is a big effect because before our study, the average annual turnover among workers was around 25%. So this means the intervention can reduce worker turnover by around about 30%. The impact on managers' turnover is also positive, but is not statistically significant. So we then look at the impact on both individual and team performance. And this table shows that there's no impact on the individual performance for workers to choose to stay in the company until the end line. However, when we look at the impact on team KPI, we do see that there's a significantly and positive impact on the total KPI. And the impact on each of those 5 subcategories of KPI are all significant, are all positive, and is significant for the production and management KPI. So how can we reconcile those two findings in which we don't see impact on individual level performance, but we do see a significant impact on team level performance? This is possible because while there's no impact for individuals who choose to stay in the company, but remember that the treated teams experience less turnover, which could be costly for team KPI because new workers normally perform poorly at the beginning and requires substantial training. So we also look at the dynamic effects on the 2 categories of KPI where we see significant impact. So there are a few things to notice in this figure. So firstly, we can see that there's no significant differences in the trend across the treated and control teams leading up to the randomized experiment. So this suggests that the pre-existing differences in the trends between the 2 groups are not driving the results. Second, we see that the impact on production KPI became significant around 4 months after the intervention, while the impact on management KPI shows up almost immediately after the intervention. So this suggests that managers begin to change their behavior almost immediately, but the impact on team level production may take more time to fully take effect. And this is consistent with the idea that effects on team level production are driven by team turnover, which could take more time to adjust. Another thing to note here is that if you look at the 2 dashed red lines, those are the 2 periods where we no longer provide financial incentives for this worker evaluation. So we continue to do the evaluation, but it did not enter the manager's total evaluation, monthly evaluation score. And we see that even during that 2 periods, we still see significant impacts on both production and the management KPI. And lastly, the impact lasts even after the intervention was over. So this suggests that the financial incentives were not the primary motivation for any changes by managers, and it was not necessary for the changes to persist over time. Okay, so lastly, we also look at the impact of evaluation managers on both workers and managers' well-being. And the results here shows that while the impacts on managers are not significant, but we do see that it's improved workers' overall life rating, positive mood, and also worker satisfaction. So in summary, the results so far tells us that allowing workers to evaluate their managers led to a decrease in worker turnover rates and an increase in team level performance, which is good for both the team managers and the company. Although we don't see significant impacts on individual performance, but we do find increases in worker happiness and positive emotions. And the fact that there are more workers choose to stay in the company among the treated teams is also evidence suggesting that they are being happier in the job. So in the paper, we look at several mechanisms that could drive this result, but here, because of time constraint, I'm going to talk about how we test one major mechanism we find, which is that managers might have changed their behavior at work, which could have led to the changes in workers' outcomes. So in order to test this mechanism, we look for evidence of observable changes in managers' behavior. So firstly, we look at the impact on some components of the worker satisfaction survey. So there are a few questions which directly relates to their relationship with managers. And here we see that in treated teams, workers report that their team managers encourage them more, criticize them less, and is less likely to lack empathy towards the feeling of the workers in their teams. And second, we also look at the impact on some quantifiable interactions between workers and managers. So here we look at two outcomes. One is the number of times that the worker reports socializing with their team manager outside of work. So we don't see any significant impact on that, although the impact is positive. And second, we look at whether the managers respond to their posts on WeChat, which is the most popular social media in China frequently. And we do see that they report, like treated workers report that managers are more likely to report frequently to their WeChat posts. So basically, this combined with the worker satisfaction survey shows that one mechanism that would driving the results could be the changes in the way that managers interact with their workers. So in order to further test like whether the improvement persisted after the intervention, we then use 69 new entrants who entered the company after the evaluation was over, and see like whether there's any significant impact on the outcomes of those new entrants. And we do see in this table that new entrants who never participated in the feedback report that their managers give more encouragement, provide more empathy than new entrants to control teams. So this is another evidence showing that the effect persisted even after the intervention was over. So just to conclude, what we showed in this study is that worker evaluation could drive many improvements, including increases in team KPI, worker retention, and worker satisfaction, where there's no outcomes getting worse. So another question to ask is why the managers did not do this on their own, given that they are incentivized to maximize the team level KPI. So a rational economic model would suggest that they should want to reduce turnover if this is costly to the team level KPI. So some reasons of why they were not doing that could be because they're making mistakes, or maybe it's not easy for them to solicit this information directly from workers in their teams. And lastly, our results did pass to the market test because the firm chose to extend this worker feedback scheme to all their plants, covering more than like 20,000 production line workers after seeing our results. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So interesting, Jing. Congratulations. That's really neat work. That's really cool. Any questions from the floor?
Yeah,
call it out.
Yeah, I was kind of curious. I mean, you definitely get at this in the latter part of the presentation, but I was wondering if you can quantify to what extent these sort of positive changes in worker attitudes are due to actual observable differences in the way managers treat employees versus maybe the feeling that workers have some sense of or some sort of control, or they feel like sort of like a worker voice kind of mechanism, right? They feel like they have the opportunity to express themselves. And clearly you're finding evidence that there are behavioral changes from managers, but I was wondering if like there's any way in which you could sort of speak to how much of it is due to workers feeling like they have voice in their workplace or something like that.
Sure, that's a very important question, and that is actually one of the mechanisms we're considering in the paper, which I don't have time to cover in the presentation. I must admit that we only have suggestive evidence on that empowering worker or worker voice channel, in which we use we look at the awareness of both workers and the managers on the like on the potential impacts of this evaluation scheme. So for example, do you know, like, are you doing evaluations for your managers? Do you know this is going to, what kind of things are going to influence for the managers? So for example, is this going to influence your manager's pay? It is going to enter their monthly evaluation score, etc. So basically, we want to test for like both workers and managers' awareness of this policy and also the consequences of the policy. And then we look at whether there's any heterogeneous impact depending on their awareness of this policy change. And we show that managers' awareness makes a big difference, where workers' awareness did not affect the results. So that is one piece of suggestive evidence that we show that workers' voice or empowering workers might not be the major mechanism driving the results.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ian, the last, I guess we're not giving you quite 15 minutes, I apologize, but almost. So.
Oh, that's fine, no problem. I'm good at hustling. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Am I good to go? All right, great. Well, thanks for sticking around in the session to listen to this talk. It's a little bit off of the theme of the rest of the papers, but I definitely appreciate your feedback and the opportunity to present it here. This paper is joint with Conrad Miller. And Conrad and I are studying dynamics of referral hiring and their implications for racial inequality. This is related, the original paper that appears in the program talks about the racial sorting on the basis of firm size, and I'm going to talk about that as well. Just reframed the paper here a little bit. In this paper, Conrad and I are studying a longstanding question in labor economics we think hasn't yet received a lot of empirical attention, and that's trying to understand how referral-based hiring might contribute to racial inequality in the labor market. And there are a bunch of reasons to suspect that racial inequality could be affected by the use of referrals in hiring. The first is that, as is well known at this point, I think, around half of all jobs, depending on the data that you look at, are found through some kind of informal contact or some kind of referral channel rather than through a formal job search process. And so this suggests that referrals are used at a kind of scale that you might expect them to have implications at the macro level on things like aggregate inequality and racial disparities in labor market outcomes. The reason that you can get disparities in racial outcomes in particular is because referral networks and social networks tend to form on the basis of what sociologists refer to as homophily, or the idea that people tend to associate or form connections with others that are like themselves on the basis of demographic or socioeconomic characteristics. And in Brazil, like in the United States, race is a highly salient characteristic along which there's considerable amount of segregation. Nevertheless, employers continue to use referrals, and there's a good body of evidence that's now documenting that referrals seem to alleviate information frictions for firms and workers that are trying to find productive matching opportunities, although there is still some evidence that they might also be used to promote favoritism, which would also have similar implications to what we're going to find here. So in this paper, Conrad and I kind of just take these basic ideas and use them to set up a simple job search model that has those basic ingredients. So we're going to assume that firms use referral networks that are racially segregated on the basis of homophily. And we follow a 2016 restud paper by Christian Dusman, and assume that firms are more informed about the match quality of their referred job seekers. In other words, they're using referrals as a type of informal screening. And so what that means is that the use of referrals will end up biasing hiring towards the racial mix of incumbent workers. And so this gives us a sort of propagation mechanism for the dynamics that are under study. The key implications of this are that racial disparities in entrepreneurship, or in the groups of workers that are present at the founding of a firm, will drive sort of persistent racial disparities in the use of referrals that give white workers an information advantage over non-white workers that carries implications for rates of hiring, rates of dismissal, earnings, and so on. So having developed this model, we then take it to linked employer-employee data from Brazil to test its predictions on hiring and turnover. These linked employer-employee data, if you're not familiar with them, these are HEIST data from Brazil. We use samples from 2003 to 2017. This is essentially a census of all formal sector employment contracts. They're collected from firm personnel records, and so the information tends to be quite detailed and very accurate because it's used to administer wage supplement and Social Security programs. So from these data, we get information on wages, the start and end date of jobs, which we need for our analysis, and then of course worker characteristics, including importantly the race of the workers as reported by the employer. These data do exclude a large informal sector. Between 40 and 50% of employment in Brazil tends to be on informal contracts. We've done some analysis in the paper that shows that basically the rates of informality between white and non-white workers are very comparable, and so we don't think that the patterns that we're finding are being driven by differential selection into informal labor market. Just to get a quick sense of the data, so focusing on all employees, we have about 474 million worker year observations in the data that we study. 40% roughly of the employment contracts are for non-white workers. And if we just do some eyeball arithmetic, you can see that there's about a 27 log point wage gap between white and non-white workers. And so while this is a bit of a gloss, it's not, for the purposes of this very, very short talk, kind of thinking about racial disparities in Brazil is not too dissimilar from racial disparities in the United States. In the paper, we spend more time thinking about kind of the sociology of race and labor market institutions in Brazil and kind of the subtleties there, but you can kind of understand the basic context as being fairly similar to the United States. So just in terms of the model, just for a quick overview, the idea is that the firm is going to fill in job vacancies sequentially, and that's where the dynamics are going to come in. And for each vacancy, the firm will either match with a candidate that's been referred by one of its incumbent workers with some probability omega, or with some candidate from the external market with complementary probability 1 minus omega. And the racial propagation is very similar because we assume incumbents, because of homophily, will always end up referring candidates of the same race, whereas external market candidates are just drawn from whatever the population distribution is in terms of race. And we assume that the referrals and the market candidates are drawn from the same match productivity distribution. The main difference, again, following this earlier work by Duesman and co-authors, the beliefs about match productivity are more precise for the referred job market candidates. We also assume that firms are able to invest in a fixed cost screening technology if they would like to, so that they're able to get similarly precise signals for non-referred workers. But because of the fixed cost nature, it's only adopted by firms once they reach a particular size or they have a certain amount of hiring that they need to get done. This is consistent with a large body of evidence from personnel and organizational economics. So finally, the match quality in this model is revealed during a probationary period, after which the firm decides whether or not it's going to retain or to dismiss the worker. The main implication of this model is that this will give hiring dynamics as a function of the cumulative number of workers that a firm has hired. So here we're imagining a labor market that has a 50-50 white to non-white population share. And on the vertical axis, we have the probability that a given hire is non-white. And so we're looking at hiring dynamics for a firm that was founded by a white entrepreneur, has a white founding cohort of workers. Essentially what that means is that the first group of workers that the firm will hire will be disproportionately drawn, right? They'll be reproducing the racial composition of the existing workforce. And so if referrals are hired with, say, 70% of the time, the worker comes in as a referral, then that means that 70% of hires will be white, and the balance will be drawn from the population distribution. And so what this means is that there's going to be persistent racial disparities in hiring, even after a significant number of hires have been accumulated, and that this hiring gap should be closing with the number of hires that the firm has conducted. So we're going to take this model prediction just straight to the data, estimating this irritating looking model. What we're going to focus on are these parameters gamma and R, which just measure the marginal probability that a hire is non-white, given that the founder has race R after N hires. And we essentially expect these gamma parameters to follow the same trajectory that we saw in the graph that we were looking at. So estimate this on a sample of 1.5, I should say million, headquarter establishments for new entrant firms that have fewer than 50 employees in their first year, including controls for occupation and region. Okay, so when we estimate this, so now I'm plotting those gamma estimates for firms that were founded by a non-white entrepreneur. And so this is seemingly very disappointing in terms of our model, because what we see is that when the firm is founded by a non-white worker, the probability that a hire is non-white is completely unrelated to the order of the hiring and sits right around the population share of non-white workers in the labor market. If we look at this for firms that are founded by white entrepreneurs, however, the pattern is completely different and looks quite similar to the predictions that to what the model suggests. And so if you were to take away one thing from my talk today, this would be the thing that I hope that you take away, is that we see indeed these very stark patterns in terms of sort of racial disparities and the probability of hire that converge with the number of hires in the workforce. And so this is not only consistent with the model, but just in terms of sort of practical implications. If we think these are firms that start with less than fewer workers, it's going to take, say, 3 or 4 or 5 years even to get out to your 300th hire. And so this means that these racial disparities are going to persist for quite some time amongst small firms, which we know tend to be sort of engines of job growth in many economies. You might be worried that this is driven by some compositional effects. And so this is just showing you the same kind of pattern holds, even if we control for firm effects. So this is estimating the same relationship within firms. That is, the probability of a non-white hire for firms with a white founder are increasing with the number of hires within a firm. So in the paper, we also look at a bunch of other auxiliary evidence. So I've got no time to talk about referral effects, but we do use the data to kind of structure referral networks based on past co-working relationships, and we're able to verify the model implications that larger firms use referral hiring less than smaller firms, consistent with the idea that larger firms invest in informal screening methods. And then we also look at racial disparities in dismissal. The model predicts that racial gaps in dismissal should also converge as the number of hires increases, based on the intuition that the non-referred workers are more likely to be dismissed because the firm had less precise signals about them to begin with, and that racial disparities in referral status will converge with cumulative hires, as we just showed. And to do this, we exploit a discontinuity in the fact that employment protection kicks in these Brazilian firms after a 90-day probationary period. And this is just showing you that at 90 days, the dismissal rate spikes. And I don't have time to talk about it, just take my word for it. This is telling you that we basically get evidence that's consistent with that a racial gap in firing rates at the end of that probationary period is declining in the number of total hires for firms that have a white founder. So this has implications for racial differences in outcomes. In particular, in the paper, we show that this means that these imply that non-white workers will face higher dismissal rates, which we see at large in the economy, have lower rates of seniority, and finally can explain to the point of the original paper why non-white workers tend to sort towards larger employers. And in the paper, we show that all three of these patterns are driven by firms that have white founders. Yeah, I'm out of time, so I don't need to conclude by just repeating what I just said, other than just to note that one policy implication is that sort of frictions that affect the size distribution of firms are going to have kind of follow-on implications for racial inequality in the labor market. And so the kinds of things that lead, like in Brazil, to a long tail of very small, low productivity firms are going to potentially be highly related to persistence of racial inequality. And,
Thank you.
Yeah,
No, that's great, Ian. Thank you. That's super interesting.
thanks.
That graph is really compelling. It's really neat. You can get that level of analysis. Should do that in Minnesota. I think we could do that in Minnesota. We have worker identity, like demographics.
Oh, you do in your UI wage record?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
It's linked to driver's licenses. So
is that a new link? Or
they've had it for a while, I think.
okay.
I mean, you could do it. I don't mean to insert myself into it, but one
no.
could do it in Minnesota.
I may thought we've got a student here at UGA who's working with Minnesota Ed and UI records, so he doesn't have that information. But so I know that it is possible to apply and get them as an external.
Yeah. It's cool though. It's really
yeah, it's very interesting.
Any other questions? I think we might get cut off soon. I don't know if Bernadette or Emily are here to tell us, but I know somebody else is going to want to use the stream pretty soon. But at the risk of getting cut off, any other questions from the floor or comments?
Yeah, I had a question, Ian. Yeah, no, it's really cool paper. So, all of the analysis that you did seems like it would carry over to something like age, right? So do you see that, maybe like less about the founder, but maybe like the first cohort of hires? I guess that criticism could, or not criticism, but wrinkle could be applied to what the analysis you already did. So like, do firms that hire originally like a set of disproportionately older workers tend to continue, have an age distribution that reflects the incumbent workers, that sort of thing?
Interesting. So we haven't looked at that. We haven't looked at that. I mean, I think my general sense is that homophily on the basis of age tends to be a little bit less, so like age segregation is sort of less dramatic, I think, than sort of like racial segregation might be. But it would be worth taking a look at, because yeah, you would expect, we can, first of all, the point that I just made, we could sort of look at in these coworker networks and try to sort of figure out whether or not that would be a dimension. No, so that's a good idea. Because the thing that we've been looking at before was sort of whether or not the patterns we were seeing between kind of racial sorting and firm size also held for gender, because it seemed like they would. And in fact, they actually don't, as much as I think we initially thought that they might. And also you might see sort of like similar patterns with gender. But yeah, we have looked kind of back and forth between whether or not this is being driven by sort of like the entrepreneur, which we can identify by linking in some records, or whether or not this has more to do with sort of like the founding cohort of workers. And we can't distinguish those two, but if you look at it kind of either, or we haven't figured out how to distinguish those two different channels, but whether you look at it one way or the other, the results are essentially the same.
All right. Well, this is wonderful, and I'm sure all the authors would appreciate any ideas and correspondence you might send their way. I know I would. So thank you all. Thanks, Matt, for organizing the session. It was really excellent.
Yeah, no, I was very impressed by everyone.
Good to be in your company, everyone else. So thanks. Have a good time, and we'll see you in some other sessions, hopefully.
Yep.
Thanks all. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
Hello, Alicia.
Hey, Darwin, how are you?
Great. How are you?
Not bad. Hey, Maria.
Uh,
Hello.
Hi, Morris. How are you doing today?
Good. Good to see you again.
Good to see ya. Oh, I feel like we run into each other all the time because I think I saw you on the
That's right.
store one later this week too.
Our weekly meeting.
Pretty much.
I mean, we could. I mean, it's an idea, Morris. I don't know if Alicia or Maria has time, but obviously I do. I have nothing else going on. Alicia, when does my conference that I'm organizing start next week?
Monday.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
For
Yours that you
context,
just finished, we're fine.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have to admit, not as much has been done with this paper as I had hoped because I got too busy organizing the conference last week. And I'm sure Darwin might be in a similar boat organizing the conference next week. And it's just so busy in the licensing world right now. Who knew that this is going to be a super popular topic that everybody wanted to be involved in?
That's
Honestly, it's nice though. It's nice. Like every time I go somewhere, I no longer have to tell people what licensing is. Now they want to fight about the nuances. I'm just like, yes, fantastic.
that's just my, that's a good space to be in where you no longer have to,
That's right.
that the idea even matters. Maria, do you know if we have screen sharing privileges yet, or
Yes.
you're on mute, Maria?
Yeah. Yes, we do have. I just.
Oh, okay. Maria's on mute though, and I don't know if she.
Yes, so do you wanna, I think you do, it looks like you do.
That,
So do you wanna have a go?
yes, I do. Okay, I'm good.
Hi, Jana. So we're just gonna wait for a few more minutes. We're waiting for.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Morris. How are you?
Nick, I don't think we've met yet, have we?
I don't think so. I've seen you present a few times, but I don't think we've met.
Okay, well, it's nice to meet you. Yeah, your name's been popping up a lot lately. So I guess you must be writing a lot in this space and starting to get involved in it. So hi.
Yeah,
Nice to
working on it.
finally
Good to
talk
meet
to
you. Same with Darwin, actually. I've seen you present before as well, but I don't think we've ever met.
you. No.
I was doing the super important thing of telling everyone where my institution is in my name. I don't know if that really is helpful, but I've started to do it. Nick, yes, I do recognize you from other events, but it's a little hard to do. Wait, where'd you go?
Oh, I'm still here.
Oh, there you are. Everything moved around. Morris turned his camera off. Yeah, it's a little hard to keep track of everything when we're in all these completely virtual settings. I'm definitely not thinking about how we should have been in Hawaii for Westerns. I'm definitely thinking about it.
Hey, guys, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
how are
sweet.
you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you,
Yes.
Alicia?
Pretty good, pretty good.
My normal webcam is not working, which is super lame. So I'm on my laptop, so lame. Of course, I'm the first presenter too, so can't like restart my computer. Alrighty, well, might just be a very unflattering picture of me. Sorry.
I have a cat complaining for attention behind me, so I'm sorry if you hear random meows through my entire presentation.
How did the conference last week go, Alicia?
Good, good. So we had We had 12 presenters and I guess another 20 or 30 people who came to watch at any given time. So that was nice. Really big turnout, lots of people. They seem pretty interested in scope of practice, especially because in the United States right now, it's a set of laws that a lot of states have on the books this upcoming legislative session to talk about or consider making some of their COVID changes permanent. So it's been nice. Some legislators have been interested in it. So it's been fun. It's been fun. Scope of practice is moving really fast right now, but unfortunately that means that is where all of my time and attention has been going lately. But
Right. Yeah. And there is another one. So there are two next week. So it's Darwin, Westerns,
Mhm.
and then it's Eds as well.
So I think Ed and Darwin are doing that one together, and then the Westerns
All
one
right,
is 2 weeks later.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah,
3 weeks.
busy summer.
You just cut a week out of my planning space there, Alicia. Westerns comes at the end of June.
Is there a co-host been named in this room?
Pardon?
Is there a co-host named in this room? Someone who would like to record the session?
Presenters, are you happy with recording the session?
3 minutes.
I don't mind if anybody wants to.
Yeah, that's fine.
So Maria, are you the chair?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
With the cicadas in northern Kentucky. I'm not in northern Kentucky.
So you're now the co-host,
I'm in Washington.
and you can hit record. Just go ahead and record to the cloud, please, and then stop at the
My
end.
neighborhood, there's not a single
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, Brad.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I'm just gonna wait a couple more minutes and then we can start. We're definitely waiting for Michelle. And other than that, we're good to go.
Is it 10:30 there, Maria?
It's 11:30.
11:30. All right, it's even worse. All right.
Yes. So yeah, I'm on my second espresso. I'm not used to staying up these late these days.
Yeah.
Maria, you and I should switch time zones because 11:30 p.m. is my prime alertness professional optimal work time. It's mornings that are the worst.
Wow. Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed my extremely professional shorts that I'm wearing because it's literally 100 degrees now in Minnesota in June.
I'm wearing yoga.
So
Do you
yeah,
see
sweet.
cicadas in Minnesota?
No, we don't.
Oh, there's a silver lining.
Yeah, it is a silver lining that we don't have them, at least now. But climate change is happening. And this week is evidence of that. So yes, I have my giant iced coffee, and that's gonna get me through this, I hope.
And we have the last session, right? And then it's the reception after us. Yeah.
That just means if we end early, no one's going to complain. That means they get to go to the happy hour quicker.
Yeah. I mean, I bring my Diet Dr. Pepper everywhere now. This is, I don't think they have that for me at conferences. So one perk of virtual conferences.
Okay, so we're going to make a start, if that's okay. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our session. So occupational licensing, and we have four great papers and 3 wonderful discussants to whom we're very grateful for accepting this opportunity. So we're going to start with Jana and Brad Larson is the discussion of Jana's paper. I think most of us know each other from forever. Jana, over to you.
Great, and
hope-
Maria, I have 10 minutes, correct?
correct, 10 minutes, and
Okay,
then
I'm gonna get my
Brad
timer
has
up
5
here.
minutes.
Sweet. I got like my timer here. This is what I need, but I don't have 12 minutes. That was the last conference.
So I'll give you a shout when you've got about three minutes left. If that's
Perfect,
okay.
thank you.
Over to you.
Great. All right, first I gotta do this, of course. All right, can we all see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yes, thank you.
All righty, well, thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone for being here on what is, I think, still a Saturday for almost everybody here. As you'll notice here, my title is a little different than what's listed on the program, but we're still going to be talking about occupational licensure, interstate migration, and what's happening when this with dual earner couples in terms of labor market outcomes. So this builds quite closely on the paper that I have with Morris, which came out last year. That paper had two pretty big weaknesses. I mean, it was a good paper, but we were only able to look at migration as an individual decision. And we also couldn't look at labor market effects after people migrated. And so that's where this paper is going to come in. For couples, right, moving isn't, that decision isn't made by one person, it's made by the couple. And often in dual earner couples, this decision is made based on the job opportunities for one spouse, and the other is known as the trailing spouse. And so how does this fit in with occupational licensing? So trailing spouses have historically been wives, right? Or in secondary earners. And also many licensed occupations are female dominated, right? So if there is an effect of occupational licensing on trailing spouses in terms of their labor stuff, this is going to likely disproportionately affect women. Okay, so this paper does a lot, and I'm going to go through this very quickly because I have only 10 minutes. So what I do three different things in this paper. First thing I'm going to do is look at how a couple's occupational licensure status affects their migration, right? Like, does it matter if it's the wife, if it's the husband, or if both are licensed in terms of, you know, how big the limiting effect of that licensure is on migration. Then I'll turn to looking at two different potential labor market effects of licensing on spouses who migrate. One looks at labor force exit, right? So if a trailing spouse is licensed, does that make them more likely to leave the labor force after an interstate move versus a between state or a between county within state move? The third thing I'll do is look at the other thing that can happen if trailing spouses decide to stay in the labor force. One effect of relicensure costs could be to force them out of their licensed occupation into another occupation after the move. So for this project, I use data from the annual social and economic supplement of the CPS. I can't use the ACS here like Morris and I did in our previous paper, which makes me very sad, mostly because the CPS is a lot smaller than the ACS, which you'll see does bite me in the results. The reason I have to use the CPS is I need information on both current occupation and employment as well as occupation and employment in the previous year to look at before and after the move. And ACS doesn't have that, CPS does. So my sample are married heterosexual couples with both spouses of working age who likely migrated together, right? They have the same migration status and the same state of residence last year. And I'm looking only at dual earner couples. So these, at least in the previous year, both spouses were reported being employed. So my empirical strategy varies a little bit for all three of these parts, but overall, what I do is, so I'm only looking at migrants, right? So I'm only looking at people who moved at least between counties in the last year. And so I'm going to compare people who moved, or couples who moved within a state to couples who moved between states. My measure of licensure is going to be, are you a member of one of these 22 universally licensed occupations that are identifiable in the CPS? It should be familiar to you if you know Morris and my paper, my previous paper. So I've got two different treatment groups, right? I've got occupations that are state-specific licensed. I have occupations that are quasi-national licensed. So both of these groups of occupations are licensed at the state level. The distinction here is how distinct or how different that licensure requirements are from state to state. Right, state-specific licensed occupations require the passage of a state-specific exam for licensure, whereas the quasi-national license occupations don't. Right, it's a national licensing exam. And so this means that the quasi-national occupations have a lower relicensure cost when they move between states than state-specific licensure, because like they don't have to take another exam. My primary comparison group is going to be unlicensed occupations. So that's pretty much everybody else. This will identify a causal effect if you believe my identifying assumptions, which I don't have time to go through, but you're going to believe them. Anyway, so here's a little table of that shows the breakdown of these occupations, so state-specific and quasi-national. Two things to note here: state-specific and quasi-national are both very heavily female-dominated. And they're also, each group is also dominated by one occupation: teachers in state-specific licensed occupations and nurses in quasi-national, which I will talk about a little bit if I have time. Okay, so first question: does the effect of licensure on migration vary by whether it's the husband or the wife that's licensed? The answer is yes. So this is the state-specific licensed occupations, right? So the red dot is for couples who are where the wife is licensed, and the blue is for only the husband's licensed, and the purple is both are licensed. As you can see, the limiting effect of licensure on migration is greater if the husband is licensed, right? So that I take that as like, you can think of that as the husband's licensure is more important in determining in limiting people, like keeping people within the same state. There's no effect for quasi-national licensed occupations. This is consistent with Morris and my previous paper, and this just compares state-specific versus quasi-national, which is what you would expect. Here, in terms of being licensed, limits your in state-specific licensure limits your migration. But what I really want to show here is how small my sample gets really quickly. So I'm not going to be using this this comparison, even though it's like better because everybody's licensed here, but there's no power, especially once I start stratifying anymore. All right, I'm already running out of time. Thing I want to point out here, though, is that this pattern here in terms of the effect of the female or the wives is less than the man's is reversed if the woman is higher educated. Right, so this is consistent with, it's not really necessarily the man's licensure that matters, it's the licensure of the primary breadwinner. Okay. Now I'm getting into the labor force exit stuff. So here I'm looking at, does the wife exit? Does the husband exit after migrating? Or do both exit? And this is actually, I think this is my strongest research design, and it's kind of a diff and diff in terms of, I compare a license between within movers and unlicensed between and within movers. So what's going on here? Well, if you are in a state-specific licensed occupation and you are a wife, you are about a third more likely to leave the labor force after moving between states than your unlicensed peers who move between states. So that's pretty large. No effect for husbands, not really any effect on both exiting, which is like, it's not retirements probably. There's also no effect if you're a quasi-national licensed. So again, those are the occupations that don't have these high relicensure costs. So as we would expect, it doesn't increase their probability of leaving the labor force. Another thing I wanted to point out here real fast is this effect on the wife's probability of leaving the labor force for state-specific wives is worse if you've got an infant, right? So what's kind of happening here is that state-specific licensed wives are kind of timing their move, or the couples with state-specific licensed wives are timing their interstate move potentially with the birth of a child, right? So they get that double hit same time. And also, if you look at only husbands leaving the labor force, it becomes significant, right? If the husband's licensed and the wife isn't, if there's no infant in the picture, right? So it is kind of, this effect is not just a women-specific effect. It's also affecting men who are licensed and their wife is not, as long as there's no infant going on. Okay, leaving licensure. Similar sort of effects here in terms of, so these are people who stay in the labor force, but they don't, do they switch out of licensure if you're a wife and your husband is not, if you're licensed and you're a wife and your husband is not? Answer is, yep, you're more likely to do that after an interstate move. I'm out of time. It's robust to a bunch of potential stuff, yay. Yeah, so just, I know I'm over time, but if you have a state-specific license, primary breadwinners, licensure matters the most in determining your migration as a dual earner couple. If you're in a state-specific licensed occupation, you are more likely to leave the labor force after an interstate move relative to unlicensed folks. And you're also more likely to, if you're a woman, leave your licensed occupation and switch to a different occupation. So I've got a couple plans for what else to do here, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jana. And yes, great timekeeping. Wonderful. So Brad is the discussant of Jana's paper. So over to you, Brad, when you're ready.
Great. All right. Am I sharing the right screen? I think I am. Got two screens here.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So this paper is just really fun to look at. I like this a lot here. So we're very interested in any kind of disparate effects, as we should be. And this is looking at disparate effects for a husband versus wife. There's a lot of literature on looking at our minorities. Are we getting minorities to participate less when we have stricter licensing? And there's a lot of states thinking about military spouses in particular. So this is from the Council for State Governments. They talk about all these state teams that are really talking about military members and their spouses. I think what's missing from both the literature and from the things states are thinking about is just, regardless of whether it's military spouses or not, is how do licensing laws have a differential effect on a couple if the husband versus the wife is licensed? And just as to illustrate that this isn't being discussed, I just Googled spouse occupational licensing and you get 43,000 results. And all of them here at the top ones are all military, something about military spouses. There's 43,000 results there. So then I tried it with spouse occupational licensing without, that's what the negative sign means here, without military, without veteran, without service member. The top hit is Jana's paper. So that's pretty cool. But then the other ones, there's just this reduced to by 2/3. We only have 1/3 of that many hits. And some of them are still military. Blue Star Family is still a military thing. So people that are thinking about spouses being affected by occupational licensing seem to be thinking about military spouses, which is great, but Jana makes a much bigger point, and I think it's an important point. So one thing I just wanted to say is that I think her identification strategy, she already showed this here, so I'm just going to jump straight to this argument, what you could say. I like the identification strategy. So it's like saying couple I has this need to move arise exogenously. The couple knows that if they move across state lines, either spouse that has a license will probably have to get re-licensed, and that's going to be costly. The couple needs to choose, so we're going to move anyway. And it turns out that they do sort of, the results suggest that they're more likely to go ahead and say, let's move anyway, even though the wife's going to have to get relicensed. And if it's the husband, they say, maybe we better not move. So the wife is bearing the brunt of the relicensing burden here. And that's, I think, the powerful result that she's finding. And the only concern that we should ever have in any OLS setting is whether one of our right-hand side variables of interest, say, is the wife licensed, is correlated with epsilon. And I think it's kind of hard to argue against her identification here. I think it's a really strong identification argument. You have to believe that couples in relationships where the wife is in a licensed occupation and the husband is not, have different epsilons, have a different a priori unobservable propensity to move than those in which both are licensed occupations. So I think that's where she gets a lot of power here. I think even more power than than the paper with Morris, which is a great paper. But I think here she's able to do, here's to illustrate one thing that she could do that couldn't, there's not enough time to say all of what I'd like to, but I think there's a lot she could do with this in more papers. It's already a great paper here. There's a lot of papers you could write with this, but one thing you could try is you could even control for a couple's occupation pair. Fixed effects for this couple is a barber paired with an electrician, or a barber paired with a computer scientist. You could do something like that. And then you could say, you could still get identification there by whether it's the husband who's in the licensed one versus the wife. And you couldn't do that in the, I don't think, in the paper, in the earlier paper, because that would suck up that is your variable of interest. It would just totally suck it up. Here you can do fixed effects. So I think there's some power there. And anyway, I'll stop. But I think this is an important paper, and I think it has potential to be very influential. And I'll share my slides with Jana afterward.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, both. Great paper, Jana, and wonderful discussion, Brad. Thank you for participating. I will move on to the next paper. Michelle is not here yet. So Alicia, if you don't mind waiting for Michelle. Can we move to Darwin's paper? So we can have Darwin's paper and Nicola's paper, and Morris has kindly agreed to discuss both of them. So over to you, Darwin.
Great, thank you. I'm just gonna pull up the 10-minute timer on my phone. Okay. Okay, everyone. First of all, thanks for coming to our session. It's nice to have people in our session who are not presenters. And okay, everyone can see my presentation now. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of this a little bit more quickly because I know you've all heard about occupational licensing, especially after Jana's fantastic presentation. So I'm going to be looking at a subcategory of licensing requirements, which are those requirements which are for people who have some sort of criminal record. And I'm going to be looking at the effect of those particular licensing bans, is what I call them, on earnings. So we know what occupational licensing is. It's a permission slip. It turns out it's more of a permission slip barrier for people who have some sort of criminal record. So I like to use this example from California. California has a serious wildfire problem every year. We also have this program where current inmates can volunteer to help fight fires, and they get paid a little bit more to do so. However, when they leave prison, they can't get licensed as firefighters. And so exactly, facepalm reactions are the appropriate reactions here. We had a minor reform on this last year, but it's still a pretty high barrier. So what this illustrates is that even if you can meet the licensing requirements, if you have some sort of criminal record, you may be kept out of the labor force for this particular occupation. I should say labor market, not labor force. So one thing I specifically wanted to look at was, do these bans for people with some sort of criminal record generate an earnings premium for those who are licensed, basically a licensing barrier within the licensing. And because the criminal records are not distributed evenly across all ethnic groups in the United States, I wanted to see if there were different disproportionate effects across ethnic groups. And then I also looked at gender for related reasons. Maria's paper on ethnicity and gender really inspired me to go for this. So I want to give her some shout out there. Okay, occupational licensing has been around a long time. One important thing we've learned in recent years is licensed people from minority groups do experience smaller wage gaps than their unlicensed peers. And so this is going to inform some of my research. We have many licensed occupations which ban people with a criminal record, which I say not convictions because it includes in some cases if you've been arrested but not convicted. It includes if you've had sealed or expunged records, it can still come into play. And it can prevent you from getting a license, even if the thing you were convicted for, say you were convicted, has nothing to do with the actual occupation you were trying to be licensed in. For context, about 70 million people in the United States have some sort of arrest or conviction record. So this has massive implications for people trying to avoid recidivism or just enter the labor market and go earn a living. Okay, last year, the Institute for Justice came out with this, I think, very cool report. Obviously, I think it's cool. I did a paper with it. And then I coded it because it was a PDF, our favorite thing as researchers. So I put it into a spreadsheet. The nice thing about this is that it's not just binary yes or no on whether or not they have licensing bans, but it's by category. So there are 15 categories across 3 different groups. And you can see there's a distribution across the United States and what this looks like. So I'm going to be looking at 3 of them. The key here is I'm going to be inverting how IJ codes it. So basically, when they said, does the state have an overarching ban on blanket bans? That means that the state doesn't allow you to just keep someone from getting a license if they have some sort of criminal record. I invert that because I want to see the effect of if you, as a state, prevent people from having a license for that very reason. I use the CPS data. I ran this with the 2017 to 2019 data first, and my results have been pretty consistent. I need the 2020 data because of the reforms piece that comes in the second part of this presentation. So I've got obviously fixed effects by year, but that's a weird thing happened in 2020 with labor markets, and I'm going to dive into that more with my robustness tests. I'm specifically restricting the sample to employed individuals under 65. My real sample that I'm looking at are people who have a license for the occupation that they work in that is issued by a state. So that is going to narrow it down, but I do account for everybody else who doesn't have these licenses just to do the comparison. And I'm just doing right now a pretty straightforward OLS. The diff and diff is coming with the piece that I spent the last like 2 months hand coding. Let me tell you, it's lots of fun. If you want to talk about reading legislation to see the timing of reforms and which reforms it was. Thank you, Janet, for all the face palms. It really captures how I feel about the process. So this is the OLS regression that I'm just throwing a lot of stuff in there, but I do some interactions between the ban type and ethnicity, gender, and the licensing status. So, oh, and I have county fixed effects and obviously robust standard errors. Some descriptive statistics that I'm just going to say, if you want to see them later, we can talk about them because I have 4.5 minutes left. I did predictive margins by logged earnings by different ethnic groups. And you can see this pretty much looks like what you would expect. These are still within people who are licensed. So this is within licensed groups relative to the mean. This is true for all the 3 major bands that I was looking at for this part of the study. The thing that I wanted to really point out to everyone here was when I isolate the estimates that I wanted to show you was these are people who are all licensed. In column 1, these people are in states that do not have criminal bans in place for any sort of criminal record. And column 2 are licensed people in states that do have these criminal bans. So everybody here is licensed. And yet we can still see in the states that have the higher barrier to entry by banning people who have any sort of criminal record. This is for blanket bans. So it's like you can be kept out for any reason whatsoever. We do see a difference in the earnings premium. And you can see that there are differences across the different ethnic groups. And then I did the same thing for women. You'll see that the differences are smaller, but there's still an earnings premium for being in a state that keeps out people who have any sort of criminal record. Obviously, in the interest of time, I didn't give you every single table I did. But the key piece is that's just a cross-sectional. That was what I was able to do with the IJ report, because that report actually just tells you what the current status was in 2020. But IJ is very nice and has an article listing all the reforms that have happened since 2015 with links to the legislation. However, it doesn't include the year. So I went through each individual legislation by state, by year, and identified which reforms there were. And this is where I've been buried for the last few months. And I coded this up. And those are the robustness tests that I'm still working on. And I didn't want to show them to you today yet, but I wanted to let you know if you're attending Westerns, they will be ready for Westerns. So that's an incentive to come to our session at Westerns. It's the sequel. As you can see, I restricted the sample to the states from 2017 to 2020. And then I dropped the states in my initial test where I'm looking at only states who changed their laws in 2018 or 2019. So I have at least 1 year before or after. And it's by the type of law reform. So this is not, you did any reform, I just drop you, it's for the specific category of reform. So this is the representation of the last few months of my life's work in a single table. And you can see there's a lot going on, but there's more going on in 2018 and 2019. And there's a lot going on for the directly related standard requiring that the license, the crime that you're keeping someone from getting a license with is actually related to the occupation they're trying to get licensed for. So that's a pretty straightforward one. It's also pretty popular to get rid of bans or to get rid of the ability to just deny someone a license because they were arrested once, which seems consistent with the innocent until proven guilty standard. There's a predetermination process where people can now say, this is what I was looking at initially, but can I get a license maybe? Can I ask the licensing board? That wasn't always available. And so now before they complete all the licensing requirements, they can check. Good moral character requirements were all over the place. I call them GMC, but basically those are getting kicked out all over the place because they were so vague and people recognize there's an issue there. So that's the still TBD piece. I am working on the event study with that, with the timing and the DID analysis. And I've just been living in Stata. And the other piece related to that is the Owaka Blinder decomposition, because I want to really sort of tease out all of these different effects by ethnicity and licensing, and then the gender and licensing status. So my last 2 seconds, there seems to be something there. It seems like there's some real barriers to entry here. And thank you for your time. I appreciate all your comments and Morris for his discussing comments.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Darwin, and thank you for the excellent paper and timekeeping. Morris has requested that he discusses both papers together. So if I may pass the floor to Nicholas, and then Morris will discuss your paper.
Sounds good.
And I believe, wonderful. Thank you, Nicholas.
Can we see my slides and they're changing?
Correct, yes.
Perfect. Always have to check on
Thank you.
when we start the timer too. All right, so I think this topic doesn't need any further motivation in this crowd, so let me just jump right into it and say that, you know, from policymakers' perspective, there's really two trade-offs in terms of the labor market when you're considering whether to license an occupation or not. And that's that on the one hand, you may limit competition, but at least from a kind of public policy view, licensing may also address underlying market failure here. So by increasing the cost of entry, we would expect licensing to reduce the supply of labor, all else equal. But if there is some sort of asymmetric information in the market, licensing could also provide a signal of quality or a screening mechanism that might limit the adverse selection and potentially increase demand. What this means is that we would expect earnings to rise following the adoption of licensing statutes, but the effect on employment could actually rise or fall depending on whether supply or demand side channels dominate. So this is ultimately an empirical question. So what I'm going to do in this paper is look at the short and long run effects of adopting new licensing statutes on earnings and employment using a new data set I compiled on historical legislation. And that's really kind of the novel thing about this paper. So I'll spend some time talking about what this data is. So I assembled the data from a comprehensive analysis of underlying state session laws, speaking about combing through thousands of PDFs. Once I get the underlying legislative data coded from primary legal documentation, I also spot check and validate everything against digitized versions of virtually all available secondary documentation licensing that's ever been published. This comes from things like the Council of State Governments, the Institute for Justice, the National Conference of State Legislatures, as well as reports looking at specific occupations, law journals. There's a lot there. What this is going to do is it's going to allow me to better exploit the timing of state level policy changes and a difference in differences event study design. So the regulation data, what it is it's a complete history of all major state and federal policy changes for currently over 250 licensed occupation categories. So this is the regulated occupation title. It goes back as far as 1870 in some cases for things like dentists and physicians. And what I mean by a major policy change is it's something that affects the extensive margin of regulation. So unregulated to license, certified to license, what's the method of regulation at a particular point in time, but it's not the intensive margin. So I don't observe things like the training requirements to obtain the credential, for example. So there's been work of this type before. So there's Beth Redbird's Northwestern Licensing Database. There's some work by the Council of State Governments looking at the early 20th century. But really the novel thing about what I do is that the policy changes are coded from the full text of the law at the time it was enacted, rather than from secondary sources or looking at statutes. So the major issue with this kind of research is that if you're looking at current statutes, because legislation is repealed, recodified, reenacted all the time, it's very difficult to actually get comprehensive and accurate legislative histories of these policies without actually digging into the underlying session laws, which is what I do. It's also the first data set of this type that I'm aware of that differentiates between alternative methods of regulation. So you can distinguish, say, mandatory licensing from voluntary certification laws. This is important because, as you'll see, many occupations that are currently licensed were originally regulated under weaker title protection and registration statutes that were later amended to licensure over time. So this really is a time series that captures potentially multiple policy changes within each state occupation cell. The outcomes are pretty standard here. So I'm drawing on several independent employer and household surveys, the Occupational Employment Statistics, CPS, American Community Survey, roughly between 1980 and 2018, depending on the data set. Again, the regulation data, this is coded at the occupation title level. So I have a mapping from each of those into 6-digit and then into 3-digit occupation codes that I can use depending on the level of aggregation that these outcomes are actually reported at in the surveys. So just to give a sense of what this variation is, what I've done in this figure is I plot the date and type of the underlying policy changes for 50 of the larger occupations that are providing some identifying variation in my data. So there's two things I want to highlight from this. One, you can see there's just a ton of different policy changes, so there's lots of variation to work with here. But there's also variation in the type of regulation. So many of the same occupations are certified in some states and licensed in others. And as I mentioned, it's pretty common for certification to be enacted first and then amended to licensure later for many of these things like, say, interior designers. The other point I want to highlight here is that because of the grandfathering requirements, that these laws aren't going to bind on the incumbents initially as hard as they are on the entrants, we have to look at very long-run outcomes in the labor market to really capture the full effect of these laws. And what you see from this figure is that the adoption of these across states is incredibly gradual. So most occupations are still not licensed by every state, but even for something like an audiologist that is universally licensed, it might be 25, 30, 40 years between the first and last state to adopt legislation for that occupation. So you do have a lot of untreated controls and these kind of staggered event study designs to work with. So in terms of what I'm actually running here, I'm going to adopt an event study framework that's going to compare changes within an occupation across states before and after the licensing statutes were enacted. So just to unpack this, I have an outcome, which is going to be either log earnings or log employment per capita for an occupation J in state S in year T. I'm going to regress that on the unit fixed effect, so occupation by state, which is the level treatment is assigned, an occupation by year fixed effect, which is sweeping out the between occupational variation, limiting the counterfactuals to the same occupation in the non-regulating states. This D you can think of as the standard treated by post indicator from a difference in differences design, but I'm doing this more semi-parametrically by taking leads and lags of these over time. And then because, as I showed in the previous figure, you have lots of these other potentially confounding policy changes going on, I'm very flexibly controlling for those in an alternative set of these kind of distributed lag indicators here. As in any diff and diff design, the key identifying assumption is that outcomes in early licensing states would have trended similar to the late licensing states had they not adopted the statutes. I'm looking over an event window here beginning 10 years prior to the adoption of the statute and up to 25 years after. So again, there's some things I do in the paper to try and think about how we might make that parallel trends assumption more plausible over these very long time horizons that we want to look at. So in terms of the main results, this is kind of the key picture for earnings using data from the occupational employment statistics. On the x-axis, you have years and event time relative to the adoption of the statute. And on the y-axis, you have log point earnings premia in the licensed versus the unlicensed state. So it's pretty clear that licensing is increasing earnings. To interpret these point estimates, it's saying after 25 years, you expect a wage premium of about 5% on average in the licensing states compared to the same occupation in the non-licensing states. However, if you run the same specification for employment rather than earnings, it's quite surprising that you actually aren't seeing employment fall after the adoption of these statutes. If anything, the point estimates are weakly positive, though the standard errors are very large here. So taking these seriously, we couldn't rule out something like a 5% decline in employment per capita after 25 years, but this is basically a uniform and statistical zero. So again, this is a surprising result because it is suggesting that the wage premium that we're seeing in the data, at least in what I'm looking at here, isn't at least entirely driven by a decrease in the extensive margin of labor supply. So one thing you can do to get a better sense of what might be going on here is because occupations that are licensed are a very heterogeneous group, it might just be the case that different things are happening for different types of occupations. And one measure you can think about is just the extent to which that licensing might be protecting consumers is at least a plausible statement. So I'm taking a measure from ONET, which is the successor of the Dictionary of Occupation Titles, called consequence of error. And what this asks is, how serious would it be if a worker were to make a mistake that they couldn't easily correct? So at the very top of the scale, you have things like anesthesiologists. At the very bottom, you have things like shoe and leather workers. But what you see is that although there's licensing throughout this distribution, licensing becomes increasingly prevalent the more serious it looks like this consequence of error is. So you can ask what happens if you license an occupation that has a less serious consequence of error than the typical occupation in the US versus more. And that's what I've done here. So focusing first on the less serious, although the standard errors are much larger because this is a smaller sample, you do see still about this 5% long run earnings premium, although this isn't statistically significant. But what's interesting is that this case, you actually see employment decline by quite a bit, by up to 25% after 25 years. Now, because this is normalized prior to the enactment date of the statute, a negative estimate on the pretreatment effect here actually means that employment per capita is increasing before the statute is passed, and this trend reverses once it's adopted. So this is more consistent with kind of a regulatory capture view of licensing, where this might be done in response to increased competition in the market. However, if you look at occupations where this risk to consumers is at least plausible, it's more serious, you see simultaneous increases in both earnings and employment that are large and statistically significant within these jobs. Again, that's kind of surprising, but because we are seeing earnings and employment rise simultaneously, it is at least suggesting that there's something on the demand side going on here. So at this point, I'm not taking a strong stand on what that is. The classical view would be a type of signaling or potentially screening, but it could just be an institutional difference, that what's happening here is you're allowing delegation of certain tasks to an occupation that otherwise may have been restricted in performing those by licensing of another occupation. So think physicians, assistants, and nurse practitioners here. The license actually creates delegation from physicians to another type of practitioner. In the interest of time, let me skip this and just wrap up. What I've shown in this paper is that at least for the most economically significant large occupations that were licensed in the past 50 years, I see licensing increasing earnings, but not reducing employment. And I just want to highlight that I'm not making strong welfare statements here for this reason. Licensing could impact competition through these more complex mechanisms where it's really competition between rather than within occupations that's going on here. And because I'm only looking at relatively recent licensed occupations, you are missing a lot of these low skill services like hairdressers. They're licensed very early in the US, but have particularly burdensome licensing requirements. So they're not actually in this sample here. And then finally, I know some of the other presenters here are doing work on this as well, and it's really interesting. There's also this issue about scope of practice could be overly restrictive, even conditional on it being welfare beneficial to license a particular occupation. You would still want to think very carefully about the appropriate scope of practice to make sure people can perform tasks at the level that they're qualified and trained to do. So let me end there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nicholas. And Maurice is discussing both papers. So over to Maurice. Maurice?
Maurice, I think you might be muted.
Yes, we cannot hear you, Maurice. You seem to be unmuted.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
So let me start out with the first paper that I received, and that's the one by Nick Carollo at UCLA. And I was very impressed with this paper,
Hey,
having
Maury.
done. Yes.
Sorry,
Can you see?
We see a beautiful picture of your wonderful children, but we
Yes.
do not see your slides.
Okay, thank you. Let me. Now do you see it?
Yes. Thank you, Morris.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thanks for interrupting me, although I'm sure that was the other one would have been nice too. Comments on Nick's paper. Let me move along. It really addresses some really overarching issues and some work that Maria and I are doing, and it really addresses the question of, is licensing grease or sand in the operation of the labor market, and does licensing address a market failure? As was stated, the question is, does it reduce adverse selection and improve quality of service that consumers are willing to pay for overall welfare effects? And one way to look at that would be to examine wage effects, which are looked at in this particular paper. And sort of all the key issues in the efficacy of occupational regulation are addressed in this paper. And this is, as is, I think, very obvious, this was an impressive data collection effort and analysis effort. We're doing some of the sorts of things at the University of Minnesota on dealing with complementary questions and issues. So what was done is the date of initial licensure for more than 200 occupations, including not only licensure, but also certification. There's a basic difference model in the timing of state policy changes on licensing. And the key results are that earnings rise by about 5% overall, but there's no to small positive employment effects. The earnings initially are very small, but the longer an occupation is licensed, the earnings effects tend to rise by quite a bit after that. So this is really a good look at the extensive margin of what licensing does and what licensing does over time. So what I thought I would do is just look at some of the reconciling of the literature. And I'm coming to this from the industrial relations union issues, is that some work on the short-term effects of unions on wages tend to be fairly small. That is, once a union is given collective bargaining rights within a firm, wage effects tend to be fairly small. In a recent, not so recent, but a study done about 10 years ago by Lee and Moss found basically the same sort of things. But this institution, that is the Institution of Occupational Licensing, tends to have more longer term effects. And that may be because the intensive margin, that is licensing, the changes in the statutes that influence what it takes to get in the occupation and stay in the occupation, tends to be very different in occupational licensing relative to other public policies. So for example, if the minimum wage goes into effect, those wages go up right away. If unemployment insurance changes go up or change the effects are felt more immediately. Where with occupational licensing, you have current or individuals who are grandfathered, which were mentioned. Those individuals take a long time for those individuals to leave the market, and new workers that have much higher qualifications to enter the market. So the effects of licensing are more likely to be affected over a longer term, which the paper suggests. In terms of employment effects, the employment effects differ somewhat from study by Blair and Chung, which are largely cross-sectional. And those results suggest that 20 to 30% negative effects on employment this study looks at finds some zero to very small effects. Now, a lot of that can be due to different methods, different occupations, and different time periods. There's a much longer time period in the current study relative to Blair and Chung and study I did with Evan Soltis. So these are some of the differences but this is an area that I think needs some deeper dives into why some of the employment effects are very different, as well as a variation in terms of the wage effects. And I think occupational licensing, maybe 10, 15 years from now, will look much like the minimum wage literature, which lots of different studies with different results. So the overall impact of the study, this is a most important contribution to both data collection and analysis. It raises the puzzle, which is an important puzzle of why there's a wage effect, but not an employment effect. And again, looking at the extensive margin in terms of data of initial licensure, this may be one of the reasons, but perhaps getting more intensive margin types of information, for example, data on the mechanism by which licensing works, such as getting data on education requirements, apprenticeships, pass rates for entering the occupation, fees, licensing boards, how they operate, continuing education, and the ability of licensing boards to cause individuals to lose their licensing over time for the full effect to be analyzed and evaluated, and I think might help reconcile some of these differences in the effects of occupational licensing. But again, very important and a key study in looking at what happens to licensing over time. Let me move on to the second study, comments on locked out and the labor market effects of licensing barriers for criminal convictions. Two very important questions, very important public policy issues. Do licensing bans for people with criminal records generate an earnings premium? So are you, if you're restricting individuals from re-entering licensing occupations, so you can't, if you commit a felony or have a criminal record, can you become a hairdresser, barber, or a locksmith? And also looking at some of the effects in terms of the impact for minority groups. And that's an important part of this particular study. The issue is very large and very important, especially in the US. About 70 million individuals have an arrest or a criminal record. And as was pointed out, there are 32,000 state restrictions against people with criminal records. And this is a particularly important issue in terms of public policy. And the question is, what happens with exclusion? People who are kept out of these occupations, the relevance in terms of whether the criminal activity was related to the occupation, and the issue of due process, that is, whether an individual can appeal a particular process in terms of whether they're precluded from being in the occupation. So what are the effects? One thing that I would have liked to have seen is a little bit more on the petitions, since they seem to have the largest effects on earnings relative to both blanket bans and no appeals, at least in sort of the basic data. Is table 1 positive effect of a licensing ban on earnings? And tying this back to another body of literature, that is, does licensing provide a signal? And in terms of the literature on ban the box and other types of criminal behavior, in terms of providing, especially minorities, with a signal that individuals have a clean record, given assumptions that individuals who are members of a minority group may have higher criminal activity, and the idea that Blair and Chung find that licensing does provide a signal to the labor market which narrows their earnings gap between the minority and the majority occupation. So tying this to this body of literature, I think would be very interesting and important. So suggestions, are these results the case for using time series or difference in difference approaches? That is, a lot of these laws go back many years. Is there, although the data collection effort is enormous, as was pointed out, a lot of these laws go back 50 or more years, and perhaps being able to look at some of the changes in the laws would allow a more detailed difference in difference approach to this analysis. The use of no petitions or no appeals, since that was shown in the basic data relative to other types of provisions. Other provisions such as good moral character, and that was provided at the end of the paper, and time limitations on the ban. For example, there are 5 and 10-year periods if an individual commits a felony or serious misdemeanor. Those individuals are banned for specific periods. If that information is available, that might also be an interesting issue. The results differ dramatically by gender. Some more information on that, and so perhaps the rationale would be particularly interesting. And again, what happens as these legal provisions grow or decline over time, since a lot of the criminal records, some of them have been growing, others have been declining. It would be interesting to see what happens over time by state, similar to the work that Nick did. So overall, impressive papers that are driving research and policy using new data and key topics on occupational licensing and labor market regulation. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to look through some very interesting and informative papers.
Thank you, Morris.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Morris. And thanks to both the presenters for 2 great papers. And our final paper is by Alicia. I'm afraid your discussant, who was joining from Geneva, is not in the room yet, but the floor is to you, and then we can open the discussion to the floor. Thank you, Alicia.
I know we have about 7 minutes left in the session, so instead
I'm sure we can have another 2 or 3 minutes. So
oh no, I was going to say instead of like a full presentation, I think I'm just going to give people a lot of food for thought for going into the happy hour after this, and for a little bit of the discussion, because this is a project that's kind of close to my heart, but it's one that's also moving a little slower than I would like. I've spent a lot of the last year working in legislative sessions on scope of practice, but this is something I keep coming back to that I just find fascinating. So let me tell you all a little bit about what I'm seeing in the data and what I think we might need to start focusing on as a group of licensing researchers moving forward. So this one's just looking at occupational licensing in ethnic enclaves. And if you're not familiar with what an ethnic enclave is, it's geographic concentrations of entrepreneurial activity from people of similar racial or cultural groups. So we find these in cities all around the world, and it's amazing and a wonderful place for a lot of sharing and a lot of cultural relevance, but it's also been a source of employment. So one of the things that I had noticed when talking to some of my friends is that they were working in particular areas because they were unable to pass the licensing exam. So it was easier to work for a family-owned business or businesses within your own cultural group, as opposed to being able to go to where maybe the customers are as well. So I was wanting to look at what's happening to the density of these ethnic enclaves, and if there might be some preclusions that occupational licensing was creating that was keeping people from getting to the employment areas that they wanted to get to because of maybe language barriers or other things associated with the license. So since we're going a little fast, let me just tell you a little bit about what we know about licensing in minority groups right now. One of the main papers that I love to reference on this is the one by Blair and Chung, which looks at licensing and how it communicates information about human capital so that employers can rely less on signals such as race and gender, but instead look at worker productivity and if someone's qualified for a job. Because of these signals, we see that the racial wage gap is smaller, especially among Black men, when there's good moral character requirements within a license license, and keeping licensing costs low might be able to facilitate fair labor market access for especially minority groups that have very high immigrant entrepreneurship rates. So it's how can we improve access through simple small changes to policy is what I was really kind of interested in. So the basic research question that I look at in this is just, do occupational licensing requirements affect the network density of ethnic enclaves? Are people precluded from being able to get to employment opportunities elsewhere or start their businesses elsewhere? That's just the only thing I was kind of interested in on this. So with this, I need data, right? So first I needed a lot of establishment data. I needed to know all the businesses that were out there. So I collected information from about 3.2 million businesses and found their exact geographic locations so that I would be able to look at all of these different census blocks, find out exactly where businesses were, how were they clustered together, and how were they operating with each other, right? And using this establishment data, since I had business license information, what I ended up doing was I matched the surname from the people who own the business and connected it to the census surname files and ran a predictability model to try to figure out what minority group this name might be most associated with or is most associated with in the census. And okay. So I was able to match about 1.8 million minority owned businesses in the United States. And I noticed that there are different clustering patterns. So we have lots of white owned businesses, but when it came to maybe black owned businesses, these tend to be more in city centers and that they had very tight densities of clustering in those areas, but were not as prevalent in maybe some rural areas. Hispanic owned businesses were closer to the borders or in Florida, while Asian and Pacific Islander had very interesting groupings of where businesses were located. And I was just wondering what's happening here, right? So with that, I have occupational licensing data on the fees, the days required. Those were provided by the Institute for Justice on like how long does it take to get a license and how expensive is it? And then the next part that I'm going to talk about is kind of the language restrictions. So that's the data set that I've been working to build for the past year and a half now. I can't believe it's already been a year and a half. And I'll talk a little bit about that and hopefully when it should be coming out. Okay, so with this methodology, I essentially just wanted to look at the network tightness. And the network tightness is just the concentration of businesses in a census block relative to the concentration of minority-owned businesses in the surrounding census blocks. So basically what this looks like, my network tightness model is I'd take a block of interest, I would draw a circle around it, and I would count how many businesses were available within a certain range or a certain size of area from a census block so that I'm able to look at a measure of the network tightness or the concentration of businesses in an area that were minority owned. And what did this look like relative to other areas? Okay. All righty. So with that, and I'm seeing I'm already almost out of time, so we're just going to go really fast. I'm just looking at how network tightness is determined or how it is affected by the fees and the days required to get a license. What I ended up finding was that when licenses cost about $100 more, there's a 4% increase in network tightening. So we see that individuals are only working and starting businesses in a very, very small geographic area instead of where customers may be throughout an entire city or area. And that we're also seeing about a 3% increase in the concentration for each additional year of education that's required. So, I mean, those are fairly simple results. And I think that there's an interpretation behind them that starts talking about why we maybe need to start considering how we can branch this into other things in the literature, because this is something that we probably need to consider with many of the studies that we're doing, whether it's how spouses are moving or how recidivism might be affected or how there might be risk. Understanding if there are particular barriers to occupational licensing is really important for understanding how people can communicate for each other and how access to jobs and opportunities are affected. So of each of this, I just find that there does seem to be something happening with local level networks of business owners, and it's something that I would like to explore more. Now, why I kind of want to talk about this is because I think that there's some policy relevance to it, and this goes into the larger project that I've been working on for a while, which is collecting data on what languages licensing exams are available in across the United States, so both within cities and in rural areas. And one thing that I really find is it doesn't really matter about these fees and the days required. Yes, we see that there might be a tightening of the network concentration, but the next piece that we need to think about is, can people understand the licensing exam at all? For example, I live in an area that has a very heavy German immigrant population, where some people may not speak English as their first language, but none of the licensing exams in my local area are offered in German at all, even though there's a German population here. So how can we both collect data, which hopefully I'll have a data set coming out for you all soon that looks at this at the county level, but how can we collect data on even the availability of these licenses to individuals, and how there might be small changes we can make, like maybe offering them in more languages in certain areas to help connect people to occupational opportunities or the opportunities to start their businesses. And with that, I am out of time. So like I said, I had something very simple for you just to kind of think about a bigger question. And that's this ethnic enclave sort of question, and how licensing might preclude this. Does anyone have any like quick comments before we go? Because I know my discussant's not here today. Oh, thanks, Brad. Also, Brad, wonderful to see you again, by the way.
Yeah, you too. Well, that was super cool. I love that idea there. How should I think of the network? What did you call it? What was the term? Network concentration?
Network tightening. So the larger the number, the more intensely contracted to a very small geographic area one ethnic group is.
That's great.
For their business owners and workers.
That's really interesting. I haven't seen anybody else looking at that. It seems like a fascinating piece that it's reducing. You're just saying it's reducing the strictness of licensing tends to be reducing integration in general, whether it's immigrant or racial integration. But yeah, that's cool.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's something really important that we need to think about, because what happens are we starting this sort of licensing that might be keeping some people in a particular area because they can't take the license, or the license is expensive, so instead they have to work for family-owned businesses. They don't get to expand out to where customers' opportunities or education can be. That's something that worries me, and I hope that we're able to talk a little bit more about in all of our studies as we're looking in this.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and an impressing data collection exercise, Alicia, I have to say.
The data's the fun part. If you all want, I'm almost done. We're doing the final checks on the data set that looks at languages throughout the United States that exams are offered in for. I think we are up to 40 occupations, and I'd be more than willing to give them to anybody who's interested in it, so we can keep focusing on this.
Oh, that's wonderful. Lovely. So I think our time is up. So I'd like to thank all the presenters, Jaina, Alicia, Darwin, and Nicholas. Thank you very much. Great papers. I think we will all agree. Our discussions, Brad and Morris, and Lyra for allowing us to host this session. I think there is a happy hour following this, but in the meantime, please, if you send me your papers, I'll distribute them amongst this network and our bigger networks that we're part of. But very many thanks to everyone, and yeah, see you soon.
Thank you, Maria, for putting the session together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria.
Thanks everyone for contributing. Yes, and see you soon, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Marley, how are you? See you're on the session. You can unmute yourself. Marley, are you there?